So we've also now outlawed incandescent light bulbs, that what you have above us and other places will become contraband in a while because we need to fight global warming. Here in Colorado, the governor has doubled our mandate for mandatory renewable energy. 20% of our electricity is supposed to be made from alternative and renewable sources. Oddly, those renewable sources do not include nuclear power plants, do not include hydroelectric. So what does that mean? It means pinwheels and solar panels, which are much, much more expensive. So we're acting, we're making judgments on these cases. Is the debate over? Here, let me just put it out there. Tell me how the debate isn't over.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, with the 32,000 plus scientists that have put their names and their reputations on the line, with the survey of over 500 climate scientists. Now, on the other side, when you hear the media talk about the world scientists agree that, or the world scientists say this, they never back it up with any data. They never back it up with any surveys, with any quantification of that. The most they ever do along those lines is they will cite the IPCC, which is the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Essentially, the political branches of the participating UN governments appoint people to sit on this panel and put together a scientific report.
All right, so this is the UN. I've heard this panel before. Say it again.
IPCC.
IPCC. This is kind of the gold standard that everyone's supposed to go off of. Would that be the right way to say it?
Well, they certainly portray it as gold standard. But keep in mind, there's only 2,600 IPCC participants versus the 32,000 that have signed the Oregon petition saying just the opposite. Moreover,
what's the Oregon?
The Oregon petition was the summary of the science presented by the past president of the National Academy of Sciences, co-authored by an atmospheric researcher at Harvard University. It's a 12-page document that summarizes the science, that casts doubt on the theory that humans are causing global warming. It's footnoted. It's got all the peer-reviewed studies, all the scientific data from NASA, NOAA, et cetera. More than 32,000 scientists have heard about it, made the effort to read it, put their reputations on the line.
When you say 32,000, the size of a small city, are these climatologists, are these meteorologists, or are these guys who are scientists who study frogs and how they jump in a puddle? Are these scientists that look at people's toes and say, you know, I think we come up with a cure for Atley's foot? There's a lot of scientists. Tell me about these scientists.
And that's a good question, because what happens is, on the other side of the issue, they'll frequently, for example, in Montana, there's a gentleman by the name of Steve Running. He's a forestry modeler, but he presents himself as a climate expert. And I actually had the pleasure of debating him, and I can tell you it wasn't even close. So what happens is they put forestry modelers and they present them as climate scientists. So this Oregon petition, you can be much like Steve Running, you can be a scientist of whatever sort and sign it, 32,000 plus. But to respond to what you just said, the two scientists at Germany's Institute of Coastal Research surveyed more than 500 climate scientists. And of course, the climate scientist, when posed with the statement, has the physical science emerged to a point that we can turn this matter over to policymakers. Do we know enough? Can we say global warming is happening and we need to address it and turn it over to policymakers? Less than half said yes. So now the other side counters and says IPCC, the United Nations Intergovernmental
Go back to the
Panel.
Oregon. So out of the 32,000, how many of those are climate scientists or have a relationship to climate studies?
Yeah, that I don't know.
Okay.
And that's why the other surveys is very important, because there are 500 plus climate scientists. But regarding IPCC, there are 2,600 members. They're appointed by the political branches of UN governments. You don't have to be a climate scientist to participate. You don't even need to be a scientist. Now, out of those 2,600, only a few dozen are responsible for putting together the final document. And what's interesting is, of those few dozen, you're not talking the world's leading climate scientists. What you're talking is you have the staff of Environmental Defense, the staff of Greenpeace, the staff of Environment Canada putting that final document together. Now, just as interestingly, for the first time, the IPCC released the comments, because you only have the lead authors, those few dozen putting together the final document, but you have over 2,000 other people that are contributing authors or reviewers. IPCC, for the first time, released publicly the comments that were made by those contributing authors and reviewers to the final document. There were more than 10,000 critical comments, objections, criticisms of the final document. So IPCC, what IPCC put forth, what the media has is their only statement, their only assertion that there's some kind of scientific consensus. You have a very small number of people. They're not all climate scientists. They're not all scientists. They're extremely biased, and there's a tremendous amount of internal dissent even among IPCC.
Then why do we have this media-generated and government-generated buzz that the science is complete. Here in Colorado, I take a look at the new regulations that are being proposed for the oil and gas industries, for the mining industries. I see what's going on with mandates for electricity, and it's all based on these ideas. It's done. The massive amounts of corporate welfare we're giving to producers of ethanol, to the producers of wind power, to the producers of different automobiles that are renewable or hybrid. This is huge amounts of corporate welfare that if they were flowing to Exxon, people would rightfully be running around with pitchforks and flames.
Mm-hmm. John,
Why?
If the science didn't back me up, if I knew that going into a debate or discussion like this, that I couldn't present NASA data, NOAA data, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, if I couldn't present peer-reviewed studies in the world's leading scientific journals showing how we are not facing a global warming crisis, if I couldn't do any of that, then what I would do is I'd go into a room and say, the debate's over, I've won. And that's essentially what's going on. They don't want to talk science. They want to get beyond the science because if they do, they'll lose. An interesting little...
As proven by lack of guests here, and of course
right.
the nobody wanting to shake your hand.
Right.
And maybe it's just because you have bad bathing habits and you ought to wash your hands a bit more often.
Boy, I hope that's not the case. I'll have to take an examination of that. But an interesting side note, historically, back when, before the Russian Revolution, when the various socialists, later to become labeled communists, Marxists, the various factions, but they were getting together and they were deciding what path they were going to take. Did they believe that you could jump right to a proletariat revolution from from not even going through the bourgeoisie revolution? And essentially what happened, you had a breakdown. And what became known as the Bolsheviks separated from what became known as the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks was Lenin's party. They eventually took over. Bolshevik in Russian means majority. Menshevik means minority. At this committee, when they all got together, these socialists, they took a vote finally after debating it. And who won? Well, it wasn't Lenin, it was the Mensheviks. But Lenin, being as smart and clever as he was, went out and called his party, the Bolshevik, the majority party, even though they were the minority. And you repeat that enough, and the people thought, wow, well, this is what the majority of the socialists believe, so we're going along with it. And that's what's being attempted right now. If we say all the world scientists agree with us, whether it's true or not, people will believe it.
And quite simply, it's obviously not true.
Right.
All right. Let me ask a little bit about your background. You work at an institute called the Heartland Institute. I've been familiar with them for quite some time. So, as everyone asks, you're obviously working for the man. Yeah, of course, the oil companies, the gas companies, those pillagers of the environment, they're paying your paycheck, and that's why you're saying what you're saying. And that science that comes from industry-sponsored groups like yours simply don't count. Where do you get your dough?
Well, there are so many different levels I'd like to respond. So let's start first, on a more personal level. Before I started working for the Heartland Institute, I was in the private sector. I made twice what I make now. I decided to take a pay cut and work for the Heartland Institute because I thought it was very important to get the truth out, and that's what we do. As far as the Heartland Institute's funding, we receive more than 75% of our funding from private individuals, and then even if you want to factor in the corporate money, less than 5% comes from any energy companies that has any dog in this fight. If we were going to sell out for money, we'd sell out on the other side where most of our money's coming from. And just as a side note, I don't even want to know who our donors are. I don't know who most of our donors are. I know a couple because people will bring it up and say, hey, aren't you funded by this, or I read this. But there's a company that used to be a donor, a fairly substantial donor. And they had a dog in the ethanol fight, and my reading of the science and the economics told me that ethanol is not good for our country. And I'd heard that this donor had the other opinion. I didn't care. We got the truth out. My boss backed me up. Also, well, we can go on, but I don't want to get too much into the donors. But the fact is, I don't care where the money comes from.
Let's get into the meat of this.